not good to get a standing O at the beginning. Expectations are too high. Rusty, thank you very much for that introduction, and you're right on in your opening comments. I very much believe the outline that you put out there, and thanks to the leadership of the New Voice for Business for inviting me to be here today. I also would like to just acknowledge Doug Brown, who's here with the Anderson School. I know that Doug, good to see you here. Let's give him a round of applause. One of the things that's key, you all know this in business, but when you educate businessmen and women, and Doug has a key component in his curriculum over there of sustainability, and we're lucky to see here Doug here today also, and all the other, welcome to all the other leaders. First, let me offer my congratulations to all of you. The New Mexico chapter of the New Voice in Business was one of the earliest business groups to band together as the new united voice for clean energy and climate legislation in Washington. Over the past year, we've seen a tectonic shift in the perception of business interests and the groups that represent them. All of you know what I'm talking about. Simply put, the old special interest groups in Washington are finally under some real pressure. While they are still listened to, large, old economy, vested interests like the U.S. Chamber are no longer the loudest voice. In fact, I've been extremely encouraged by the vocal protests of some major U.S. Chamber members, including Jeff Sturba, P&M. Jeff left the Chamber to protest its attempt to block climate change legislation. And P&M isn't the only one, the only Chamber member to protest the old voice of business. Some of the nation's largest utilities have also left the U.S. Chamber, including Exelon and Pacific Gas and Electric. Companies like Nike and Apple have resigned in protest as well, and many other members of the Chamber have spoken up. Once the Chamber realized the impact in political positioning we was having on its bottom line, it did some serious backtracking. Over the course of a couple of weeks, the Chamber went from calling for a debate about the science behind climate change to sending a letter to Congress expressing its desire to be a partner in developing climate legislation. That's a big change. Whatever the Chamber is changing positions, I think the group here today, all of you here today, represent a movement more important than the fact that some of our friends in big business are finally seeing the light. Rather than changing the time, we need to change some of the voices. And we are going to need new organizations like yours in the legislative process. Organizations with new voices, and new blood, and new energy. And if we are going to transition our old, polluting, inefficient energy economy into one that relies on homegrown, clean, American-made energy, this is what we need to do. New Mexico, as you know, is in a strong position to be a national leader in this clean energy revolution. In our state, we have first-class solar resources in the south and west, and wind resources in the north and east. New Mexico also has major biomass opportunities from dairy operations and forest management, and more than half of our state is a potential geothermal power source. We've got a lot going for us. A quick look around the room today is really proof of that. And just as all of you are working hard to make New Mexico a national leader in clean energy development, I want you to know we are trying to do the same back in Washington to create clean energy initiatives and bring quality jobs to New Mexico. A couple of quick examples, and Rusty mentioned the first one here. First, renewable electricity. New Mexico is a leader with a 20% by 2020 renewable electricity standard. Leadership that has been instrumental in attracting renewable energy businesses to our state. In the Senate, I'm working to build on that progress, and the first bill I introduced as your United States Senator was a 25% by 2025 claim. That's what I gave my maiden speech on in the Senate, was that particular piece of legislation. Second, biofuels. As your congressional delegation, we're working to develop a state biofuels plan. Our goal is to harness New Mexico's unique biomass resources like algae that can use brackish water, or low water using plants, or the output from forest restoration projects. Third, renewable electricity transmission. The recently announced Tres Amigas project in Clovis will tie together America's 3 major electric grids for the first time. This will allow for the transfer of wind and solar from the west to population centers. And finally, we're working to reduce dangerous greenhouse gas pollution, a strategy that will also create jobs by spurring investments in energy efficiency and renewable energy. So those are a couple of things we're working on, but I also want to give you an update on the status of climate and energy legislation in the Congress. While healthcare has been the number one item on the agenda for the past year, a lot of folks in both chambers and from both sides of the political aisle have been working to develop energy and climate legislation. And as all of you know, last summer the House of Representatives approved a combined comprehensive clean energy and climate bill, which they call the American Clean Energy Security Act. Over in the Senate, we have also been working on several pieces of related legislation. In the Senate, 2 different committees have jurisdiction over energy and climate. The Energy and Natural Resources Committee, which Senator Bingaman chairs, worked on an energy bill. The Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, or the EPW, which I serve on, worked on a climate piece. And in June, Senator Bingaman's committee reported the American Clean Energy Leadership Act. I know he came before this group back in October and described that legislation, which includes a renewable electricity standard of 15% by 2020, 4% of which can be met through efficiency and not renewables. Jeff is a champion of the RES, and he got the strongest standard he could out of a tough committee. And I will work with him to increase that standard as we move forward. As I mentioned earlier, I've also introduced a bill to set a 25% by 2025 federal standard for renewable electricity only. In November, the EPW committee approved a climate bill sponsored by John Kerry and Barbara Boxer that reduces greenhouse gas emissions 20% by 2020, which is higher than the House bill. Unfortunately, much of our work was repeatedly delayed by obstructionist tactics by committee Republicans led by Senator James Inhofe of Oklahoma, who does not believe global warming exists and strongly opposes any action. At one point in the markup, the committee markup, all of the Republicans left the committee, walked out, and they never came back. So that shows you the kind of situation we're dealing with. And last month, as I think many of you are aware, President Obama traveled to Copenhagen for the International Climate Conference and secured a groundbreaking agreement where developing nations agree to reduce their emissions for the first time. All of this activity brings us to today. Now that we're in the new year, Senator Kerry, Senator Lindsey Graham, a Republican from South Carolina, and Senator Joe Lieberman are working on a bipartisan basis to support climate legislation. The legislation that ultimately emerges from this process will probably look different from the bills approved by the Energy and Environment Committees and probably look somewhat different than the House bill. But I'm confident it will draw on major elements of all of these bills. But I want to be honest with you, moving forward is not going to be easy. The old interest groups are still fighting us, and some in both parties are making it difficult for bipartisan cooperation to prevail. Many of my colleagues and I, along with a diverse alliance of clean energy interests, are going to be working hard throughout the year to make this happen. Many of my colleagues in these areas want to do the right thing on energy and climate. We can make it easier for them to do the right thing if their constituents know it is the right thing. That's where we need your help. So let me end by saying thank you. This organization gets it. The work all of you do over the coming weeks and months will mean the difference between an economy stuck in the past and one that is a global leader. One that creates good jobs for hardworking Americans, protects our national security by putting our nation on a path toward energy independence, and preserves the environment for the enjoyment of future generations. Thank you once again for inviting me, and this is the part that I'm looking the most forward to, is to your questions. So Rusty, are you going to moderate that?
Senators Cantwell and Collins recently introduced the CLEAR Act, which would auction 100% of carbon permits and return 75% of revenues to taxpayers. Will you support this, and if not, why?
You know, I from the beginning in the climate legislation have always thought that we should auction up to 100%, and I believe that because I think we really create the market very quickly, and we move forward. But the reality is that we don't have the votes for that. I mean, that's been a good, solid position. There are many positions that are out there in terms of how to improve the legislation, but just within our own caucus, we don't have the votes. I'm going to continue to work on that with Maria Cantwell and others. But the reality is, I think that probably the majority of our caucus and some, the 8 or 10 Republicans I mentioned earlier are looking more at a transition kind of auction where you start out cushioning the blow and then working more towards auctioning everything.
Another similar question. What initiatives are you involved with that will make the transport of renewable energy truly viable?
Well, the first thing that renewable energy, transport of renewable energy viable. Let me first of all question the premise a little bit, because one of the things, and I know Bob Meng and I many times have discussed this, we should try to do as much as we can locally and homegrown in our communities. And I would applaud Jason and the PRC that's trying to work on that. I mean, to the extent that a business or an individual invests in renewable energy for their own residents or for their business and produces additional energy, it should be bought back in the system, I believe. I mean, I think that is a great incentive to amortize this over time if you let people do that. And so I really believe that we first start locally. We first start homegrown in our communities, and we encourage everybody, businesses and individuals, residential use, all of that, to do the best they can in their own context. And then we move to the next level. And the next level is the question, which is, what are we going to do? Because we're in a fantastic position, as I talked about earlier. Our resources, we could do our entire state many times over. So we're going to have excesses here where we're going to be able to export. Well, the reality is that we don't have a grid to do that. In many places around the world, these kinds of grid decisions are one central agency. Well, if you, and Jason knows this, getting together with his counterparts across, I mean, we have the craziest patchwork system of a grid that we've ever seen, and we need to get over that. And I think Jeff Bingham's bill moves a long way towards that. And that's what I'm supporting, is the provisions in his bill that I think look at a nationwide grid, try to connect all of us. What we did at Tres Amigas, I think, is also very important, where we interconnected those three major pieces down in Clovis. But those are the things that I'm supportive of, and I think it will move us a long way if we get that grid in place.
Another question regarding...
Rusty, let me say one more thing on that. I just had one more thought. The contrast is amazing when we talk about investment. Here we're spending at the top when oil was at its highest. We were spending $700 billion a year, sending $700 billion out of this country to bring oil into the country. To build the grid we're talking about is 10% of that. 70 billion are the estimates that come out of the Department of Energy. So, you know, and oil's going to go back up again. You can count on it. I mean, I don't want it to happen, and nobody wants it to happen, but that's the nature of the market. So, you know, we need to think in terms of how we're spending the money. If we're spending that kind of money, wouldn't it make a lot less sense to spend 10% of that on a major investment that's going to grow our energy here and make us a lot less vulnerable? Sorry about that.
That's okay, we have plenty of time. On cap and trade, given that it might not start with 100% auction but have a transition period to, as you say, cushion the blow, separate from that, the money that comes in from the auctions, where will that money go?
Well, where will the money go? Right now the proposals are I think, pretty in sync. The House, the two House bills the House bill and the two Senate bills. And basically, a large part of the dollars that come in are going back to cushion the blow on consumers. I mean, that's where a major effort is going to be put. So that's a part of it. And then you look throughout the various industries that are also impacted, and you're trying to help them transition, trying to help them put investments in place for the future. As all of you know as business people, I mean, many of the major investments in the energy area occur over decades. So if you're going to do a big plan, you're talking about it being talking about it operating for 50 years, and you're talking about a major capital investment. So when we make the shift over, let me just pick, for example, coal-fired plants in the Midwest. We've all known for ages that these coal-fired plants have to, they're old behemoths. They're outdated. They need to be shifted over. They need to be shifted over to natural gas as soon as possible in a transition. And so one of the things we're doing in our Senate bill is to try to put the incentives in place to do that. And so those are the kinds of examples, I think, throughout the bill that where you use the resources to hurry up the transition and to put us in a good position there.
Current studies show nuclear energy at 25 cents a kilowatt hour. After more than half century, we still have waste and proliferation issues unresolved. Can we afford to continue spending our precious public dollars to guarantee and subsidize the nuclear industry? Why can't we truly let the market decide?
Well, that is a very, very important part of this whole mix. There's so much on that I'd like to talk about, but let me just tell you in general where I think we're headed. Because if you say the marketplace will do it, the estimate on the House bill, and these are objective estimates from outside groups, is that if you put a price on carbon in the marketplace, as the House does, and you move in that direction, you immediately take sources that have no greenhouse gas impact, which we know the renewable sector has, but also nuclear. 70% of our non-greenhouse gas energy is from nuclear today. You make them more competitive. There's no doubt about that. By putting in place a cap and trade system, you make them more competitive. And really, I think what the crux of the question is in making them more competitive, in doing that by putting a price on carbon. I think that's something we're all pretty much agreed on. The question is how you do that. Then the next step is how do we, with the various dollars throughout that are raised through the system, how do you put those in place to try to be even-handed with all the entities that are going to be out there in the future? And I think it would be let's say, unrealistic to say that to get a bill, we're going to have to, there are major groups of senators that want to see nuclear power as part of the bill. So the 8 or 10 that we're talking about that are being looked at, that are interested, that are working with John Kerry and this group, the question is how you put the incentives out there. I believe that the incentives, the lion's share of them, should go to the industries, not the mature industries, but the fledgling industries that are out there to try to help the solar and wind and geothermal and the others that are moving along. So that's where I come from on that.
The U.S. Congressional Budget Office released a report last year that compared costs related to cap and trade, carbon tax, cap and trade with a safety valve. The report indicated across the board a straight carbon tax is the least expensive and fastest to implement. Bearing this in mind, how is the carbon tax being considered as part of energy legislation?
Well, it isn't really. I mean, there may be a few proposals in the House and a few proposals in the Senate that maybe a senator or two or a House member or two are on. But for the most part, I think what we've seen with groups like yours, with many of you are probably familiar with U.S. CAP, some of America's major industries stepping forward and saying, we know we need to do this. We know we need to do energy and climate change legislation. And we believe Congress is the best way to do it, and we believe that Congress can put a system in place working with the President and his agencies to soften the blow on consumers and others that are out there. So it may well be we will come back to that if we can't succeed. But I think that the momentum right now is to put a system in place where we cap emissions, where we put a price on carbon, and where we work through that kind of system to get it done.
What role can states like New Mexico and regional programs like the Western Climate Initiative play to encourage federal action on climate change?
That's a great question. And I know that's going to be sitting in front of GAY and the Environmental Improvement Board here in New Mexico sometime this year. If we didn't have the pressure at the national level from states with Western Climate Initiative, the Northeast Initiative, there are now, I think, close to 32, 33, 34 states that have signed on to these climate initiatives. So that's a big push. We have U.S. CAP, where they've pushed, your organization and many others like it around the country. Mayors of major cities, I think we're over 1,000 mayors now that have spoken up and talked about what they want to do in terms of initiatives. All of the, and let's not forget, when President Obama took office, Lisa Jackson at the EPA issued that endangerment finding. And they have said, and I've encouraged her when she's come before the committee, I said, Lisa, you have to make sure you keep up the pressure that something is going to be done. And you need to sound loud and clear the message that EPA is going to regulate under this endangerment finding, and they're going to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. If Congress doesn't act, EPA is going to act. So all of that is forming the momentum to push us forward and get a piece of legislation. So I think the climate initiative is important, but all these other things I've mentioned also. So I think we need to encourage all of them to move forward with great speed, and then I think it builds throughout our society the ability to get a good piece of legislation through.